The idea of landscape. The impressive rocky outcrops, known as La Serranía de la Lindosa, are found in the middle of the Guiana Shield, an extensive geological formation located in South America's northeast. This area is covered in thick vegetation, has a considerable presence of water in its different states, and gives the inevitable sensation of being far from the bustling streets of cities. In spite of its distance from urban life, one of the stone systems that forms part of the mountain range has received the name Ciudad de Piedra, or City of Stone, because the morphology and the distribution of these great rock formations evoke the impression of a city, whose architecture is distributed in a grid, complete with perpendicular lines that appear to be streets or roads. Located 20 kilometers from the provincial capital of Guaviare and about 300 kilometers south of Bogotá, Ciudad de Piedra is composed of quartz serenites, sedimentary rocks made up of sand-sized particles. Under a microscope, a mass of tiny grains is visible that together form this sedimentary rock, which in turn combines with other rocks of similar characteristics to form the 300 square kilometers of the Ciudad de Piedra. In this rocky territory, located in the south of present-day Colombia, the interdisciplinary project Ciudad de Piedra was born, an artistic approach to the geological landscape of the Department of Guaviare. The research team is made up of artists and geologists from the National University of Colombia, whose work aims to generate reflections on the landscape using interdisciplinary methods of information gathering, analysis, and hypothesis formation. The most wondrous thing when observing these quartz sandstones in detail is to see the undeniable similarity between the grains under the magnifying glass and the vast stony landscape that rises above the ground in Serranía de la Lindosa. It is a game of different scales in which the image generated by the microscope in the laboratory could well be a tiny landscape that is found among the stones. When we raise our eyes from our machines and our magnifying glasses, we find before us a huge landscape, a mountain range that lies peacefully between the Orinoco Plain and the Amazon rainforest. Then it becomes clear that these are not different landscapes, and that the image observed through the microscope and these enormous stones have the same beginning and are indeed the same. The accumulation of grains remains united, and play their part in shaping those grey giants in the middle of the forest. The landscape overflows the frame. It goes out through the limits of this imaginary rectangle that restricts the look of the observer, reducing it to an object that poses for his or her delight. When we break into that distant horizon and begin to inhabit it, entering that great rock, we realize that this landscape is in constant movement and being transformed, either by the forces and insistence of natural rhythms or by the influence of human hands. That same hand that in a matter of a few years is capable of denuding a mountain and turning it into a quarry is also capable of producing pigments and making enigmatic and lasting marks on the rocky surface, reminding us of the vital possibility of inhabiting this territory without the need to destroy it. Approaching this small node of the Guiana Shield has allowed us to understand that the presence of human beings in these territories is not, nor should be, synonymous with destruction or excessive exploitation of the land. Among these great stones, there are communities that have built their sense of life and identity in relation to this territory. Such is the case of Cerro Azul, a rock shelter in Lindosa, which is also an important archaeological site containing hundreds of cliff paintings. The display of these pictograms tell us about the passage of animals and humans through this territory, the same territory that we continue to transit and inhabit today. This Guiana shield is transformed thanks to the confluence of different vital rhythms that occur simultaneously in this huge territory. Just as we established a relationship of spatiality between the rock and its components through a game of scales, this process goes hand in hand with notions of temporality. Earthly scars tell us of unimaginably long periods where the human condition is reduced to a tiny portion of time. From this condition, we translate the vital rhythms to our own language and measurement systems in order to conceive the ephemeral life of some insects or the longevity of the stones as part of the same ecosystem. To inhabit this landscape implies to silence ourselves and to listen attentively, to observe carefully, to feel the touch of the forest with the whole body, and that the humid air of the other place nests between the folds of our own skin. This rocky outcrop may not tell us in our language the tangled history of its existence, but in its enormous body lies the trace of the patient and seemingly imperceptible movements that constitute it. Let's imagine a drop that falls in the same place, a portion of water that finds its nest in the pores of the stone, or a liquid fibre that flows until marking a path on the rock. Water is a fundamental being to think about this landscape or any landscape on the planet, either because of its incidence or because of its scarcity. Among the rain, the clouds, or the rivers, it is that force that with its presence and movement generates scars in the crust of the earth and leaves a record of its passage through the surfaces. It is enough to look at a hydrographic map to understand the metaphor that is often made that springs and rivers are the veins and arteries that keep the life of a region interconnected and in constant flow. Water is life in latent movement. Its force in the precipitation, together with the oxidation of the air, carves the stone, leaving a series of cracks as a testimony of its presence. It is these traces of movement, or the insistence of the fall on the skin of the stone and the course of the water, that sculpt the stony landscape of La Serranía de la Lindosa. A repeated movement, a subtle action that seems insignificant, but that as a whole is capable of moving mountains, of carving enormous stones, of generating marks on a rocky body. These flows, movements, and insistences force us to rethink the temporal spectrum in which we frame the events of life. Some of the timeframes that we have assigned to events in the inhabited universes and to our own daily lives fall short in imagining the millions of years that a stone lives, or the time that water needs to mold a landscape. The idea of landscape that we propose here points to some interwoven experiences that include humans, but also those beings that are fundamental for thinking about the Serranía: insects, vegetation, water, large rocks. All these beings, insofar as we consider them human and non-human, and the relationships between them, are indispensable. Nets and voids. This relationship reveals a kind of network where the interaction and movement necessary to create life in the mountains is evident. This circuit is characterized by the multiplicity of links, breaking with unidirectional and hierarchical paradigms, thus showing that all the components of this system are important. The network not only served us as a metaphor to talk about the vital flows, it was also an image that astonished us throughout our investigation because of its repeated appearance. In Nuevo Tolima, another area characterized by the presence of the appearance of cliff paintings, there are repeated patterns from large compositions on the rock surface. The nets were there, like reddish patterns that when repeated over and over again leave traces of other inconsistencies. Both the repetition of the sand-sized morphologies that manage to conform a huge figure and the repeated fall of a drop of water that sculpts large stones are inconsistencies that reveal the enormous power of constancy, those small actions that together manage to transform realities. As a meditative task, nature is transformed between its repetitions and rhythms. Following this model of creation and variation of nature, the human beings of this group, the artists of this group, have generated works that modify the matter starting from similar forces, the one that is needed to model clay or to weave big stones from jute fiber. Methodologies of encounters with the rock. In the phenomenon of the insistence of water on the earth, gullies are generated as marks of geological history. The gullies can be understood as ditches, holes or tunnels in the earth's surface that have been shaped thanks to an erosion process, resulting from the contact with the water that lies between the earth's pores, allowing the quartz sand grains to be slowly detached. From this detachment, the characteristic forms of La Serranía de la Lindosa are sculpted, grain by grain. The footprints and casts extracted from the rocky skin, the photographic series, the sketches, the performatic actions in situ, or the conversations among the members of the group derive in several pieces that were formed in a coming and going between the mountain range and the laboratories. With its vital rhythms, its scales and emptiness, the mountain range has become a place of interstice and therefore of encounter. This rocky system made it possible to permeate the boundaries between art and science, making it clear that working procedures, categories, and concepts are much closer than they seem. The production of knowledge, research, and creation would not be possible if from the places of the academy we locked ourselves in our disciplines as if they were glass towers from which we looked at the world with arrogance, isolating ourselves from bodily experiences, from relationships and communication with other human and non-human beings. The huge sedimentary rocks seem at first to be a solid and impenetrable unit. But when we observe them, touch them, listen to their cavities and touch their cracks, we realize that they are actually an accumulation of layers and layers of quartz sandstones, layers and layers of time. At the crossroads of knowledge, we were aware of the porosity of the stony boundaries, but also of the porosity of the boundaries between disciplines, knowledge, and methodologies for creation.